Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tree School Online. I'm Glenn Ahrens, OSU Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties, and it's my pleasure to be your host today for the webinar. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project, and to the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to cover expenses. Tree School Online webinars are scheduled every Tuesday from now through July 28th. There's 2 webinars each Tuesday, one at 10 and another at 3. I have some housekeeping details to discuss. The Zoom toolbar should be located at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, you can scroll your cursor over that area. It should pop up. On some hardware, such as iPads, the Zoom toolbar is sometimes on the top of the display, and many features can be accessed from the toolbar. Audio is muted for attendees, and just the speakers and the hosts will be audible. Video is not available also for attendees. We want you to post your questions, written questions, in the Q&A box. So you should see that box on your Zoom toolbar. And I'm going to monitor that, and you should ask your questions right when they come up so we capture them. And then we'll have a break in the middle and at the end and go through those questions. And we're asking that you use the chat only if you're having problems or to notify us about some technical problems, but put your questions about Brad's talk in the Q&A. Also, there's going to be resources posted on the Tree School Online Class Guide page, and you can reach that from knowyourforest.org. You can click on the webinar description for Brad's webinar and all the webinars, and you should be able to see the resources and also a recording after today. We'll be recording Brad's talk as well as all the Tree School webinars. We're going to use polls during this webinar to find out a little bit more about you and the audience, and that'll be at the beginning and also at the end. And they should pop up on your screen in a box, and after you answer the questions, the poll can be closed. If you don't see the polls, check on the Zoom toolbar and see if there's a lighted button that says polls, and you could pop that up. I know it doesn't work for 100%, but we hope that you have a chance to participate in the poll. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Brad Withrow-Robinson, our speaker today. And Brad, you can turn your camera on and your microphone too. All right, there he is. So Brad and I have the pleasure to be your extension agents in the Willamette Valley, from Brad's territory down in Benton and Lynn and Polk County, and I'm up here in the northern part. So I've had the chance to work with Brad for about 25 years, and we would like to be your team. And today he's going to talk about a really important topic that I think we get as many questions about thinning as about anything. And Brad has a lot of experience and insight to share, and a good dose of reality. So Brad, why don't you get started?
All right, let's see what happens when I press the first button. Not what I wanted, so there we go. Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm happy to be here to talk about this topic and about thinning young stands. And so today, just to be clear, I'm going to be talking about stands and trees that are in their tweens. That is between the planting establishment phase, which is usually from age 0 to 6, and sort of when commercial thinning might begin, which is year 25 or after. And the idea is to think about early thinning as a way for you as a landowner really to stay on track for your vision and long-term goals for your property. Yes, of course, older stands also have needs for thinning and issues there, but today, though we will talk about both sides of that tween phase to some extent, the conversation is about that tween stage, and we won't really be handling any of the questions about thinning older stands, except perhaps in overtime if we've handled all those other questions. So I ask for your patience on that so we can focus on this issue. And the other thing, past tree school seminars have been largely folks from Western Oregon, and that is sort of the focus on this There will be a strong northwest-centric view, but generally speaking, a lot of the concepts that we're talking about apply, though the details of numbers and stuff would be different. So the outline for today will be to talk about some concepts and definitions of thinning, reasons and relevance of young stand thinning to you, family forest landowners, a little bit staying on track, what you're trying to stay on track for, if it's for you, would it be a helpful practice for you in your situation? And finally, we'll have some approaches. And as Glenn has said, we're going to have a Q&A session in the middle and then at the end as well. And hopefully I can help you in your thinking about this. With that, I believe Glenn is queued up to give you the poll.
I am. And there's another thing I wanted to mention, which is if you want to get some continuing education credit, if you're a Oregon professional logger, through the Associated Oregon Loggers, we offer continuing education credits. And there's a form to fill out for that on the resources page about Brad's talk. So with that, I'm going to start the poll to learn more about our audience. So here it comes. So you should see that and just start answering all those questions, and I'll see them as they come in. We're just trying to find out where folks are from. As Brad said, we're going to focus mostly on the west side and northwest Oregon, but elsewhere it would apply, the principles would apply. Finding out if you're a woodland owner or natural resource professional. Also, if you own forest land. And particularly, Brad has a question about whether you manage plantations in that tweener stage, that 0 to 15 years, which we're really focused on here. So I'll just watch as these answers come in, and then we'll close the poll when it looks like people are done voting. It usually just takes about a minute or so. I usually wait till we get to about 80%, it levels off there. So it looks like right now we got about 80 folks participating today. Good to see. All right, it's your last chance to vote. Here we go. I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So I hope you can see that, Brad. Looks like about 75% of us are from the Willamette Valley area, and then 9% from the coast, and then a scattering elsewhere. There's some in Washington State, about 5%, and then 6% from elsewhere in the United States. And as far as woodland ownership, looks about 80% are woodland owners. So this is for you, private natural resource professionals, agency foresters, another almost 20% are foresters. And then there's 5% of the folks that are not forester or woodland owner. As far as acreage, the bulk of folks are in that 10 to 40 acres or 40 to 100. About half of us are in that range. I've got a few acres myself, so I'm in there too. And about 5% that don't own forest land, and then another third or so, or another half almost actually, about a third over 1,000 acres, 100 to 1,000 acres. Okay, do you own or manage plantations in the 0 to 15 year stage? So about 80%, so that's good. And then there's some that don't, but there's important stuff to learn. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Brad.
Okay, well, great. I'm glad to see there are so many people who have those younger stands. 0 to 6 is not within the tween stage exactly, but it is it's of the age where it's very relevant now to be thinking about and thinking about these things that we're going to be talking about. And I guess I'm certainly happy to have the other 20% of you who, I don't know, perhaps you're just sick of not being able to go down to the donut shop and visit with friends. So happy to have you, and hope this is at least as exciting as that. So we're going to begin the actual discussion now with a little bit about concepts and definitions of thinning, which is really a pretty straightforward idea. Thinning is removing trees to make room and make resources available for the remaining trees so that they can flourish. We need this because as trees grow, they just need more room, more resources as they get bigger. And that's because any given number of trees will get more and more crowded, relatively speaking, as the stand grows and the trees get bigger. Okay, so crowding happens. And it's also important that you remember that there is a limit to growth at any site. And specifically, that has to do with how many trees of a given size can grow per acre or for a certain area. And as we begin to approach that limit, then tree growth and vigor begins to slow down due to competition. And so we're doing thinning to reduce the crowding, and then therefore that lets the remaining trees grow with less competition, at least for a while. Now, thinning can be done repeatedly in the life of a stand. We have here over on your left, we have a bar here illustrating that with planting over on the left and a final harvest over on the right. And it's not uncommon for certain landowners to do repeated 3 or possibly even 4 thinning harvests indicated by those arrows in that life of a stand that might be 70, 80 or more years old. When you do it, when, how often, and how a thinning is done is really going to depend on different landowners' objectives. And parenthetically, of course, not all landowners choose to do thinning of any sort. A significant amount of our landscape is actually managed this way by much of the corporate forestry ownerships are managed on a much shortened rotation age with planting, no thinning, and then a final harvest, maybe in a 35 to 45 year span. So it doesn't have to be done in forestry. For a lot of people, thinning is generally reactive, or in many ways it is reactive. When a stand reaches a certain level of crowding, it's thinned. And that's just how it is. I know a landowner I was talking to just told me, well, I go out in the stand and I'm watching how the crowns are developing, and when they start getting too small and the growth go, then I thin. And that's pretty straightforward. And so we're thinned, and if logs are sold and money is made, then we call this kind of thinning a commercial thinning, because money is involved. As I say, it's pretty straightforward most of the time, certainly if you have larger trees in the mid or later parts of a stand's life and development, because whenever you harvest trees, they're big enough, they can be put on trucks and sold, and at least to break even. The problem occurs in the earlier part of the life of a stand, when trees can become very crowded and dense, again, relatively speaking, early in the life of the stand, but the trees are still too small to be able to sell and make any money on. They might be pulpwood or something like that. So that's the dilemma that people have. And I'll illustrate that with a common scenario, unfortunately, a rather common scenario, where I get a call from somebody. They have a stand of younger trees, maybe 25 years old, they think. And they've been out in there, and they tell me that they think it's looking crowded and it maybe needs to be thinned. When I visit or talk more, it certainly turns out to certainly be overcrowded. Trees have begun to compete very significantly, and you can see that the crowns are very small at this point. Some trees are weak, dead or dying directly due to the competition that's going down. Some may even have fallen down. And so then the question comes to thinning. And it often turns out the trees are actually quite a bit older than the person realized or was thinking. You know, time goes quickly now, and the understory is barren of anything. It's not very appealing to them, and so they are interested in thinning. But the problem is that this stand, having grown into this highly competitive stage and been there for perhaps quite a long time, and many of these trees are beginning to die of competition and thinning down, and the remaining trees have very small crowns, that stand has all sorts of issues that make thinning a challenge, if not unadvisable. They may not be firm, wind firm. If you open it up with a thinning, they may just fall down in the wind or a snowstorm. And they may very likely not respond very quickly after the thinning. They may just have to sit there because their crowns are small. They aren't going to jump and start growing very quickly. So this often puts the person in a difficult and challenging situation. As I say, it isn't meeting many of their current visions or objectives for the property, which was something more like this. But the options for thinning have become very difficult. The trees started competing very early. They're still very small, low value. It would be not cost effective to do a thinning. Very likely it would cost money rather than make money. It would not be a break even. It could be left exactly as is, perhaps for a 40-year or so final age, and then clear cut. After all, that is one of the ways that a large part of the landscape is managed, but that's generally not the objective of this family forest landowner that I know. So they're in a quandary, and I really find these difficult calls. I hate going out in these calls, and because there's sadness. People had imagined this on the left, and instead they have this on the right, and not really a very good way, having missed an opportunity. And that's the key thing here. It's getting into this bottleneck of a young, highly competitive stand, which is self-thinning, costs a landowner a lot of opportunities and decisions that they can make about how to manage that stand in the future and how to manage it for some of the different benefits that they tell me and their friends and themselves that they really want from it: habitat, aesthetics. So this bottleneck, the point of this conversation is to point out that this bottleneck, I think, is completely avoidable, and it can be done with a young stand thinning, which has also historically been called pre-commercial thinning, because not that someone's doing it in order to make money or not, but that it is done at a time when it's recognized that the trees don't have much economic value, and you're just thinning them to improve the stand for the future. And so young stand thinning is done early, proactively. It's a proactive density adjustment to reduce the number of trees in the stand so that you can get to that first entry at a time when it can be break even and before significant crowding occurs. So it's a way to avoid excess stress and competition and to maintain your future options for management. So that's the general idea of it. So does young stand thinning make sense for you? It certainly doesn't make sense for everyone. Not everyone does it, as we've talked about. But I do think it very often makes sense and ought to be practiced perhaps more often for family forest landowners because of observations I've made through conversations over the years in that scenario or other. And so the observations that I'm basing this on are: one, family family forest landowners' goals are not the same as industry goals. So that seems obvious enough, but generally in years of different sampling, you come up with a list something like this, where things like aesthetics, protection of nature and habitat, recreation, including hunting and fishing, are pretty high on the list, and things like timber production barely make the top 10. So quite a different set of priorities from corporate forestry objectives. Observation 2 is many of those family forest objectives, landowner objectives, are best achieved by growing older forests. That is, having a longer rotation. And that and other objectives benefit from maintaining lower densities at the beginning, but also throughout the length of the stand. And so controlling density lets you improve or adjust the type of wildlife habitat you have, forest diversity. Many of the aesthetics go along with those more diverse forests rather than those very dense forests. It may have a role in your fire strategy, fire prevention. And then I'm often in these years of drought have been hearing people concerned about just keeping their forests healthy, and density management is an important part of that as well. And then my third observation, again, pretty obvious, is that family forest landowners' resources are not the same as industrial owners or corporate owners' resources. You just have fewer options in management and timely management than some of these others. There's a huge difference in the economy of scale between you and Weyerhaeuser. They have a regular cash flow because they're harvesting every year in and out. They have staff foresters monitoring, knowing where a stand is in its competitive development. They also, because they're harvesting all the time, creating that regular cash flow, they have ready access to a workforce, to the different logging crews and so forth, that family forest landowners often complain about not being as easy to get someone in as timely a manner as they want. And then they have other skills, consulting and road building and things that are at their fingertips that family forest landowners just really don't have. So it's worth keeping those observations in mind, and that's where I came to say, well, gee, we ought to be rethinking this, because the density decisions that you're making really need to reflect your goals and objectives. Now, gardeners get this. Yes, they have a strong aesthetic, we know that, but they're also really clear about what their objectives are. They're growing for something, and they're pretty clear about that. They also have a very clear understanding of the effects of density, how it relates to what their objectives are. And they know what to do about it. And, turns out Pinterest is full of tips for thinning carrots. And I was just amazed by that, out there snipping. So, and fruit, information about thinning fruit. You have too much fruit, it's not going to produce fruit of the type you want, so you thin it. Family forest landowners, on the other hand, have been much more ambivalent about this idea of early thinning than gardeners have. And there's a number of very understandable reasons for that. Pre-commercial thinning, a young stand thinning, especially on uneven ground, can be really hard work and or expensive if you're hiring it. The needs and the benefits of doing that thinning are less clear. It doesn't happen in 6 weeks like in your carrot patch. The nature and pace of how trees grow is just much slower. And, those folks who call me up and say, oh yeah, it's 20 years old, turns out it's really closer to 30, things just move fast, time passes fast and the moment goes by differently. And so as a result, you just kind of have to trust and follow the numbers a little bit, which is what we're going to be talking about. and also kind of overcome your instinct, because we're talking about making adjustments to density at a time that many people have just finished their planting and establishment. They've gone from these tiny, vulnerable little seedlings to these well-established 14-foot trees or something, and they're free to go. Their deer aren't bothering anymore. And then this extension agent comes by and says, you know, maybe you ought to just whack a few of them. And so their instinct has been to take care of these, and not to go in there and do a thinning at this point. Excuse me. So, and this is the gist of it here, is that this is what it comes down to. The common plantings and planting spacings and the densities for Douglas-Fir in Northwest Oregon, and I said we would be kind of focusing on that, have tended over the recent years to be 10 by 10 and 11 by 11. And that's 440-ish to 360-ish trees to the acre. We used to plant more 8 by 8 several decades ago, but now the standard is 10 by 10, 440, or some people are backing off to 11 by 11. The issue is that these densities, the trees generally need to be thinned before they are ready to be thinned in a thinning harvest. And I'll define those terms as needing to be thinned, as crowding and competition is becoming intense. We're beginning to see growth slow down, but also competition stress that's beginning to weaken trees. A normal process, but undesirable at some point. And ready to be thinned is the idea that the trees are large enough that a thinning harvest will pay for itself. They will at least break even and avoid a lot of additional expenses. And ready to be thinned in Northwest Oregon, yeah, it's going to vary from place to place, situation to situation, but generally what I hear from consulting foresters and others is that you need an average stand size of about 10 inches at DBH or better to reliably have a break even or better operation, which is, you know, growing trees. Remember, we looked at what landowner objectives are. Making money isn't necessarily the primary objective, but not spending money is a pretty strong instinct for family forest landowners too. And so with a 10-inch, you can often get a saw log out of the lower part and have some pulpwood as well, knowing that pulp rarely makes money, and it's the saw logs that allow you to break even or better, and therefore avoid costs and maybe have some money to put into some of the improvements on the property that you're interested in. So here's the issue. I'm going to illustrate this by looking at a stand density table. And the way this one is set up at any rate is we have some different colors, and the competition zone is those intense colors over there on the left-hand side of the screen, going from the green, very low level of competition, to the red, through a couple zones of yellow, to the red, which is getting to be pretty significant level of competition. And then up in that brown zone is where competition has become fairly extreme and is really harming the current growth and vigor of the individual trees. And so, and then in the columns, across the top, at the headers of the columns, we have the trees to acre, the density in trees per acre from 250 on the left over to that old 8 by 8 spacing of 680 trees to the acre. And then in the columns below are the size of different trees. So we can look at, if we go over to the second from the right, the 10 by 10 spacing, we can look down at the bottom, and I have a panel covering the bottom of my screen, but the trees are growing enthusiastically. They have lots of room, are growing vigorously. When they're still 5 inches, 6 inches, we begin to see some competition. And what we're interested in is how big they are as they enter that red danger zone. That's kind of the late, if not the optimal, the later point of when we would like to do a thinning. And when that point is going to vary according to your objectives. But for generally, even for optimizing growth, that's kind of the later point of entry. So the trees in any stand would need to be thinned as they enter that red danger zone. And you'll see that in that 10 by 10, that column for the 10 by 10 spacing, those trees are entering the danger zone when they're 7 or 8 inches in diameter, DBH, which you'll recall is about 2 inches smaller than we said stand average should be if you're hoping to break even at that first entry. Now the issue here is, of course, there's going to be, that's an average. So there are going to be some bigger trees, 10, maybe even 12 inches, and there, because competition is slowing things down and some trees are falling behind, there'll be some smaller trees. But when you're going in and doing a thinning, you're not wanting to take those bigger trees. The bigger trees that would help you break even are the ones, generally speaking, that you're going to want to be leaving behind. Those are the ones that have the bigger crown and will respond most positively. So this stand here at, in that 10-inch, that 10 by 10 column shows that that stand is going to need thinning when they're still really quite small. And that's the dilemma that I often encounter when I go out with landowners and see those very dense stands that I told you about in that scenario.
Excuse me, Brad, could you define DBH? I had that urgent question there.
Oh, okay. So diameter at breast height, D standing for diameter, and that's how big around it is. And foresters, thank you very much for asking. Foresters traditionally measure this at a standardized height so that it has consistent meaning. And that height is called breast height for a guy about my size. And that's 4.5 feet measured on the uphill side if there's a slope. So we try to put some consistency in it. So with this column, we're looking at this 10 by 10 column, that tells us what the average size of the tree will be when it's, entering these different competitive zones. And what I'm looking at as we're saying, it's entering the zone of higher competition, they're going to be 7 or 8 inches in diameter right here at breast height. And I'll stand up right there. So that's what we're looking at. Okay. I hope that answered that. If there's any other urgent questions, Glenn, interrupt. I guess we're good. Thank you. Okay. That contrasts with what we were describing, which was being ready to thin. And ready to be thinned is what we defined before as an average of about 10 inches there. And we want that 10 inches to be reached before it gets too far into that danger zone. And so here, if we look at the second column from the left, at about 275 trees to the acre, we find, there you go, you're approaching your average just as you reach that 10-inch, just as you reach that threshold between that good growing Goldilocks zone and entering into that highly competitive danger zone, by which time we usually want to do our thinning. And that happens right there at 275 trees to the acre. So depending on your objectives and a little bit about risk and how certain you are, you can get a logger in at the time you want them. You might be saying, well, I'd like to have, I'd rather have somewhere between 250 and 300 trees to the acre. That gives me a pretty good chance that that stand is going to be well in that 10-inch average when I enter the stand and do a thinning, and me and the logger can probably make some money on it, or at least I can break even, and hopefully the logger will make money and be interested in coming back and seeing me at another time. So the issue here is, how do you get from one? You're over, you know, many folks are in that column of 10 by 10, and we're wanting to be over somewhere in those columns on to the left. And so we do, the idea of the young stand thinning is to enter very early in the life of the stand, when it's 3 or 4 inches in diameter, that it's 6 to 15 years old, and thin out some of those trees until you move to the left in those columns, somewhere between the 250 or 300 trees to the acre, according to what you want for your objectives and your situation. Okay, so we had stand that needed to be thinned, but was not ready to be thinned. Or the key thing here is, by knowing your stand density, you can see where this is going, and will it reach the need to be thinned at the same time that you think it should be ready to be thinned. And if not, then the young stand thinning is the method to move the density of that stand from a higher density of 340 or so trees to the acre down closer to 275 trees to the acre, so that 10, 15 years later, the stand will reach a 10-inch size when it's still vigorously growing, has not gotten a lot of competitive stress, particularly important. That's been illustrated for those of us in the valley during these years of drought. We've kept the stand actively growing. We have deeper crowns. We may still have some diversity growing on the forest floor because the stand is moving along rapidly. So that's the idea of doing the young stand thinning, and about the time that we're talking about doing it. And again, this is different from older stands, those blue arrows sort of on the right end of the growth line for trees. Because when, as that other landowner, Dave had said, when I go out and I look at the crowns, when he's crowded, he can thin because they're bigger trees. They put on some size, and he knows he'll have a market for them, and he can watch the market, and he or she can watch the market and put them on sale when he needs to. And he's likely to find someone who's willing and able to come in and do that work. The challenge is making sure that we have a similar situation when we need to, or we arrive at the point where we want to do that first entry. And it's that young stand thinning, that green arrow pointing up from the bottom, that allows you to take that uncertainty out of that, and mean that first entry can you can get it done, you can afford to get it done, and you can take charge of your future options at that point in the thinning that you do at that point. And we have arrived at our first time for some questions and answers. That went quicker than I thought. So I may have been, if I've been moving too fast, well, we have time to clarify some things.
I think the Q&A is a good place to clarify some things. So there's a lot of good questions here. So we'll get started on that. Okay.
Get a piece of paper here so I can jot things down if I need to.
Well, it's my job to help you keep track of these things, Brad. I have them written in front of me too. So
good for you.
We'll do it together. So the first question comes to mind. Instead of planning to perform a pre-commercial thinning or young stand thinning, why not just plant fewer trees?
Yes, good question. And I hear that one often, and I think that's a conversation we should have. It's a little different because I'm often talking to people who've already done the planting. But also there are reasons that we plant extra trees. So as I say, it used to be we were planting 680 trees to the acre, 8 by 8. One reason is nursery science wasn't then what it is now. We have a lot of uncertainty out in the woods. We are in a Mediterranean climate where we often have 3 or 4 months of summer drought, no rain, and our survival rate just in the initial couple years can vary quite a lot. And then we have deer and rodents and various other things. So there is pretty good reason to go ahead and plant some more than you need. Tammy Cushing, our extension tax and business specialist, spent a lot of time, grew up and spent a lot of her professional time in the South. And apparently there, they grow their pine trees just at the density they want. And she finds this, or used to find it, puzzling why we would go ahead and plant extra trees. I think she sees why, you know, and so the thing is you plant the extras as a hedge against risk. And there is enough variability and uncertainty in our seasons that that's where people are. And that's perhaps why, as we get a little better in our science and planting, our nursery management and planting, that we are drifting down to lower densities. You know, you might want to go down a little lower, 300, around 12 by 12. But again, you want to have some hedge in there for some uncertainty.
Very good. Well, and 400 trees per acre shades out blackberries a little better too.
Yep. Yep.
So here's another one. Mixed stands of Douglas-Fir, Western Red Cedar, Valley Pine, etc. Composition varies as the site varies. And Douglas-Fir, you'd expect me closer than the table. I guess the question is, how do you decide when you've got mixed species? You know, how do you set a goal for Valley Pine? And so I'll let you start on that. You know, or do we have guidelines for mixed species or other species besides Douglas-Fir?
We do have some guidelines for other species, and one of the references, which will be pointed out at the end, and which is already posted on the resources site for this webinar, has tables like the ones that I did, where we tried to do them for, we included them for different species because they're not always easy to find. These are based, those tables, they're estimates, but they're very good estimates in many ways based on years of research for the different species. Some are probably a little more reliable than others. And so it would tell you how, it would help you figure out how much competition is going on among those trees of a species. How you figure, you can use that to inform you, but it's not a real simple direct line between the space. You kind of defer a little bit to the needs of the one which is least competition tolerant. And Glenn and I can follow up with you on that. I'm not prepared to try to explain how to do that. But first off, yes, we have different tables for densities, competition levels for a bunch of the species common to Western Oregon. And you can use that in a variety of ways to help you figure out some of your mixes. One of the ways people manage mixes, of course, is to have them in clumps, little clusters of the different species, and then you're managing the competition among the pines or among the hemlock more than between the hemlock and the fir, for instance.
Yeah, and we can put them in order. We know Ponderosa Pine needs a lot more space than Douglas-Fir, for example, and you don't want to crowd them too much if they're close to a Doug-Fir. You need to give it the amount of space a pine needs, not a Doug-Fir. So, and then kind of the range of spacing versus average spacing, kind of how do you deal with the fact that it's going to be irregular, and how do you get at the average? And that's, I think, going to get to another question about how do you figure out trees per acre? Is there a simple way to get that?
Certainly the second question is part of the presentation that's coming up. We'll be talking about finding trees to the acre. The other question will probably be reinforced, but you know, the spacing does not have to be rigorous. I mean, some of the old spacing recommendations, they talk not so much about trees to the acre, but average distance. And that was always a little odd to me, because in Western Oregon, where I've done all my work, these trees are planted very often in a plantation at as regular a spacing as crews hired or cajoled from your family can do. And so if they're planted at 10 by 10 and the spacing recommendation says they should be spaced at 12 and a half, how do you do that? And I realized, watching and talking to colleagues in the East, that if you're thinning self-seeded seedlings, you have several choices along a scale, and it might be a little easier to get there. So density helps you figure that out. And so we will talk about how to get a sense of what your density is, but your spacing doesn't have to be perfectly uniform. The trees are quite capable. They're fairly flexible in that. And in fact, many of our different objectives that I hear from family forest landowners being interested in are served by not necessarily having a very uniform spacing, even from patch to patch, having a little variability in the spacing, because you get a little more variability in the stand conditions. For timber management, if that's your priority, and it is on parts of the landscape, more uniform spacing is probably a higher priority than for many family forest landowner objectives.
Okay.
That sounds like a got it, Glenn. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to keep kind of coming back around to that, you know, but the fact is spacing gets off. It's not regular for very long. As soon as you thin a little bit, or trees, some do better than others, and you pick the best tree, you end up with irregular spacing. So then you really have to go back to how many per acre, not so much how far apart are they. So that's something we need to learn. And then a couple more questions, but kind of around the same thing, you know, why do we plant so many trees? So I think we've covered that in general. You know, to meet a 200 tree per acre minimum for forest practices, you know, we generally are going to plant at least 300 unless we're really confident that all 210 trees are going to survive, you know, but also for, you know, capturing the space, giving you some choices as to winners and losers amongst what you plant. So I'm going to move on to another one. Is there time to discuss the role of pruning along with thinning? And I'll let you decide on that, Brad.
Yeah, we'll see an example of that in the very next slide, as a matter of fact. And pruning is independent of it as far as a decision of spacing. Pruning brings a variety of advantages. One of them, several of them would include, by removing lower branches, people can potentially influence fire risk and behavior. And especially in certain areas where there's frontage on a road, that public road, that can be very important. It also hugely increases your own accessibility and visibility within the stand. So, you know, that dense thicket of brush in your face, you do a pruning lift just to 5 or 6 feet, and the feel of the stand, your ability to move through it, see things in the stand, see things that are your trees, and get a sense of how your stand is growing or how your woods are evolving and so forth, improves a lot. So there's reasons to do thinning that make a lot of sense for family forest landowners, and a lot of them do it. A lot of them do it in lieu of gym fees as well. And so, and then once you've done a thinning, it makes some of the other things you want to do, hand or mechanical thinning, is easier too, because visibility is improved. So those are some of the reasons that thinning might be done and is helpful, but yeah, we'll leave it at that.
All right. Another question here. You describe corporate forest management style distinct from family forest owners, perhaps a shorter cycle with little or no thinning before a final harvest. So given that stand density table, how do the corporate forest managers use that table or look at that, or do they just plant the trees?
Oh no, they let's see if I can back up. Without a pointer, I'm not sure. Let's see what I can do with that. Okay, so
You can use your cursor. It might show up as a
can
pointer.
people see this cursor? Glenn, does that?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so we'll trust that people do. So corporates are probably growing over here somewhere, and their objective is to get a return. Well, they have many objectives, but to do timber and fiber production in a fast and efficient manner. And so many of them are going with a style that, getting there fairly quickly with minimal inputs after planting establishment, doing significant investments at planting establishment to get stands rapidly growing in those early years. And then they step back and the stand starts growing. Let me get my cursor going. It starts growing through level of low competition. Crown closure happens in here somewhere in this green phase. And then we go into this robust growing area of the Goldilocks zones. And sure, if they're not thinning, the stand will start slowing down and competing. Or actually what happens is the growth of the individual trees slows down as competition goes up. But the growth of the stand, as measured by the volume growth, really gets optimal in here somewhere and continues. Even as the individual trees are slowing down, the rate of stand production, the productivity of the stand stays fairly high. But what happens is, as this competition goes up, we see, rather than them thinning, we have natural self-thinning. That competition, when competition goes up and trees start dying of competition, that's what we call self-thinning. Self-thinning starts happening in here somewhere. And then what happens then? Well, actually, we're not in this column anymore. We've moved over here a little bit. A little more self-thinning happens, and we moved over here a little bit. So as the stand grows towards a culmination point, it grows. The individual trees are slowing down, and some of them are dying, making room for the other trees. And so they'll harvest over here when they can't get up to that point. The density curve will flatten out here somewhere. And so that's what they do. They plant the spacing a little more moderate, and then they will let it run, knowing that some thinning will occur, and they're okay with that. And that natural thinning that occurs lets the trees get up to a size that is now acceptable for their mills, smaller size timber.
The big difference is they're not trying to keep future options open to grow a stand to 80 years and keep thinning, where it's full of wood and they start over again.
Correct. So they made their decision on what their objectives are, and they're living with that.
So I think it's time to get back to the presentation. We got a bunch more questions, but we'll save those to the end.
Well, I'll have answered everything by then.
Everything.
There won't be any questions left at the end.
Very good. Good luck with that.
Okay. So I got to get back line of thought here. So thinning. Thinning young stands, we've talked about what it is and why. It's to give room for stands to reach a useful size later. You can do it earlier or later. This is at the late end of that tweens window that I was talking of. This is like a 14-year-old stand. And this is a landowner in Benton County, Van Decker, who is hosting a field trip that we were talking about this a number of years ago, and was himself trying out some of the different ways to get it done, and you can't see him doing it right now. He's got his chainsaw, but he was also kicking himself for letting this stand get this far along before he thinned it, because he knew he needed and wanted to do it to meet his longer rotation objectives that he had, and to grow optimal, larger size trees, which is what he wanted to do. But it was a lot of work. It took him, 5 or 6 cuts through the stem for each of these trees if he wanted to cut them and get them down in pieces. So that made it a lot of work, and it was not how we really wanted to do it. So we've talked about it. I wanted to point out again a few of the, we've talked about some of these advantages of young stand thinning, where you're reducing the number of trees early in the life before heavy competition, and that lets the remaining trees put that growth on, rather than you're putting the growth that is a stand level growth onto fewer, more selected trees. And so it's to bring that, the two opposing stresses together early on in your first entry of ready to be thinned when it needs to be thinned. But an important point to note is, and this gets pointed out by a number of consulting foresters I talked to, you also get there sooner, right? You get there sooner because you've lowered the number of trees, you stay in that green and yellow zone longer, the tree is growing, stays growing more rapidly longer, and that smaller number of trees puts on side. So you get to your thinning, your initial entry generally earlier if you have done your density adjustment through a young stand thinning or PCT earlier on. And the earlier the better from that point. Or as that earlier question, if you dared lower your spacing to exactly what you wanted at planting, same thing. All that growth would be happening on that smaller number of trees. So you get there sooner. Getting there sooner is also important for many of those secondary objectives that landowners have, and keeping your options open. Because if it gets there sooner and you haven't had that stand sitting there in a highly competitive state for as long, you may still have more understory, you have a deeper crown and more of your trees, so it's going to be more responsive to the thinning. You may not have lost all of your understory through an extended dark period, so you may be able to see some resurgence, or at least retaining some of the understory diversity that many people want to have or see as their image of what their forest looks like. You're avoiding that excess stress, which again, if you're far out in the coast range, maybe isn't an issue, but as we see with drought stress and insects and disease issues in the valley, anything you can do to reduce some stress, it can also often be helpful towards your forest health. And again, just to reinforce it, keeping ahead of your thinning helps you expand and keep your future options open. I can't stress that. That's really the point of this, is not thinning isn't, as one of those questions pointed out, if you're interested in timber production only, thinning is more optional, because you can go to short rotation like Weyerhaeuser and get to a good yield on small logs. Or you can thin a couple times like Starkers and get a higher quality, larger log later on. Those are good. But if you're trying to grow for some of those other amenity issues on your property, then thinning is really the key. And the earlier you start managing that, the more options you have. So this is really, these thinnings, and particularly time length thinnings, are really critical to meeting those non-timber options for people. And I think that's one of the things that I struggle to get over to people sometimes, because they see a harvest as opposed to many of the things that they're trying to enhance on their property. But if you started with a stand density that was planted to cover all options, it needs to be modified if you're going to get some of those values and opportunities that you want. You got that? So that's sort of the challenge and contradiction there. You got to break eggs to make an omelet. And Thinning is often the way you get to the forest diversity, structural and composition diversity that many people want and are hoping to try to get in their forest management. Okay, so yeah, I've told you there's some really good reasons to do young stand thinning. There are also some other, there are potential problems or negative outcomes from it, and you want to be aware of those potential. Having weak stands and blowdown potential, that is possible, particularly if you've deferred your pre-commercial thinning later and you're getting up to when you might almost be thinking of being able to do a commercial harvest, but you realize it isn't going to be, and you're just going into that black hole phase and not seeing a way out anytime soon. Those might be situations where you've already missed the boat. You've waited too long. The cost and returns are, you have to put money out or do a lot of work early on. And if you're not interested in that, especially if it's getting late and you're not opposed to certain stands on your property being managed in shorter rotations, and that's fine with you, then that's good. There's some issues potentially with insects and diseases. Not so many with Douglas-Fir. There could be some, a few issues that come up with Douglas-Fir, such as black stain. But boy, if you have Ponderosa Pine in the valley, young stand thinning has to be approached very purposefully and carefully, or you can see some insect outbreaks that occur because of your management actions. So you definitely need to be aware of that. If you do young stand thinnings and you really open things up, I've seen sun scald and sunburn happen, particularly on more exposed, drier, south-facing slopes in and around the valley. Some people don't like it because, yeah, you're getting faster growing trees and you get a little more taper, you get bigger branches. By and large, they look rough, but the consequences of those larger branches are not big enough to actually have any great impact. But people, even with the young trees, like seeing a really nice low taper, smooth tree. And you give up on that for a little while if you're thinning and growing. Oh yeah, there it is. So as you know, of course, your objectives, if you want to grow short rotation, then there's no point in doing it perhaps. And then as Glenn pointed out, if you do young stand thinning, you're opening it up, you're creating growing space suitable for understory, including blackberries and Scotch broom that lasts a little longer. So, no good turn goes unpunished if you do some early thinning to adjust your spacing. As if you planted at a lower spacing, you're going to have to plan perhaps on doing a little more other type of weed control, because as we all know, nothing shuts the lights out on blackberries or Scotch broom like a vigorous stand of Douglas-Fir does. So an early closure on Douglas-Fir is a fine way to take care of your blackberries, but there's a consequence to that. And so you need to think and balance with that. And there are probably others, but this is just to make you aware that there's pros and cons to this. There's a lot of advantages of having lower densities, whether it's been planted at a higher and you thin it down, or you decide that you can afford, or that you're willing to take the risk of planting at a lower density because you're confident in the site and your abilities to get a good establishment. So, so those are some of the issues, and it comes down to you thinking about how important is a young stand thinning likely for you? Is it something you should do or not? And I've developed a worksheet for you to help think about that. It has two sides, and it at tree school in Clackamas County, I would hand it out to you. at this point, and I would make you fill it in and all that. We're not going to do it. It is on the resource page for you, and you can print it out. And I would encourage you to do that and think through it a little bit. And so it asks you first to think, well, what are my goals and objectives? It helps you collect information about a stand or two. You know, I had slots for 2 stands. You know, how big is it, et cetera. How old do you want it to get? Are you interested in short rotation, long rotation? I had a couple questions about densities, and that's getting at this question we're moving towards next. A lot of people don't know what their stand density is. They may have an idea of what it was originally, what it was said to be planted at, and you know what it was planted at and what actually it was isn't always real tightly correlated, especially not from patch to patch according to growing conditions and the planters and what time of day they were there and so forth. And if, yeah, so those are the that's side 1 of the page, something for you to think about, and you could fill it in for, you know, whichever stands you have that are in that 0 to 15 year age class. And then the other side is arranged like this, and it's has some of these different factors, some of the important factors that I've thought of and observed that influence the potential value of growing it lower, doing young stand thinning to get to a lower density in a stand earlier. And probably the 2 strongest ones there are your goals and objectives. What are you wanting? And you know, including in that is a target rotation length. Are you thinking of growing it for a long old stand or short? And then the other really important one would be the density that it's at. And so here's these different factors, and then in the columns beside that, there's mostly 2 columns of the situation. I mean, for each of those factors, your goals and objectives to grow for diversity, multiple use, or timber production, I think is what that says behind my, yeah, timber. Target rotation length, long or short, very relative. Density, if it's 400 or more stems down to something under 250. Size of stand. These are all things that we've observed have an influence on that decision. And, you know, a small stand is, that's an important factor because a small stand is going to be harder to get someone, a logger in to do, especially if prices are good. They'll have other bigger jobs. These are different things that influence that decision. And you can probably think through them, and you should work through that a little bit. And I encourage you. You can just circle them. And the gist of it is the things in that left-hand column are factors that are favoring the value or the usefulness of a young stand thinning for, you know, my general observations of family forest landowners. And, you know, over on the right, if most of your circles are on the left, then yeah, you should definitely be thinking about the young stand thinning. If most of your circles are over there on the right, then those are things that say, well, young stand thinning may not be as important or feasible for you. All right. Yeah, one of the parts of that worksheet is how many trees do you actually have there? And this is pretty easy to find out, at least as a ballpark figure. You can certainly go out and into a stand and very quickly get a sense of what the density is. And we do that by going out and measuring a plot and counting the trees and measuring the trees in the plot. And we have there's some pretty established ways that we can do this, and they're outlined in this publication that's listed in the lower left, and that, I believe, with a live link will be in that resource page that you'll find on the tree school page. And the idea is you basically go in somewhat randomly and you mark a plot center, and then with a tape measure, you go out and you determine what size planting you want to, what size plot you want to take, and that can vary often by, you know, the age of the trees and all, but you choose a size. Let's say you're going to do a 1/20th acre stand, which is a plot, which is pretty common. That would mean that you're doing a 26-foot 4-inch radius, and you'd go around and you'd count the trees within the plot, and then you would multiply that by 20, and you'd know how many trees to the acre that represents. And so that's a basic way to do it. There's a lot that goes, there's whole disciplines in forestry that come down to accurately measuring. And if you're out measuring to try to figure out volume, that becomes very important, but if to follow those methodologies. But the idea here is to get a sense of, you know, different parts of the forest of your stand, what is the density? And, you know, you're not necessarily looking to find a representative sample. You're going out to say, well, what is the density in the densest areas that I might most need to do? And how about over on that hillside? Well, that's less dense. Maybe I don't need to thin that at all or much. So you're not necessarily trying to go for a representative sample, but you're trying to inform yourself so that you can go through this thought process. Okay, we're going to close by going through fairly quickly, some approaches to young stand thinning. And because there are some different ways to do it. It is a different decision process than, you know, out in an older stand where you're waiting until it gets to a certain crown size or density as represented by that. And you're making a lot of decisions by quality of growth and log. You're looking for defect and so on. That's less of a factor in young stand thinning. What you're really trying to do is get that density down within the realm that will allow that stand to grow really without a lot of stress and reduction up until you thin it again in a thinning harvest. And so there's different approaches. I'm using here again a stand from Van Decker's place. And Vann would be a candidate for someone who could have planted at the spacing he wanted. The aerial photo of this stand, which had formerly been a Christmas tree field, was harvested and then put into new trees for timber. He had about 99% survival. So all 440 trees per acre were pretty much there. And he realized that's not where he wanted to be. So ways that you can go do it is, you know, very familiar, as most people would think. You can go out and just remove individual trees. You could do it very systematically. This is what I've illustrated here, is where I took every third tree. But really, you're thinking more about taking one of every third or fourth tree, depending on how many trees you actually have out there. You'd want to do a plot. My illustration on the left shows Vann's pretty much 100% survival, but that's not what everybody has. So you get a sense of what you have and what you're trying to get to. And rather than going out and trying to systematically remove every tree, you would walk down a row and maybe take one of three. You'd stand in the row, you'd look at 3 or 4 trees around you, and you would very quickly make a decision of which, you know, if you see any significant defect in the lower stem, well, get rid of that one. If you don't see any defect, then it really doesn't matter as much which one you take. You might pay attention to where you took a tree out just prior in the 3 or 4 trees before, but the idea is to get that size reduction, get that density change accomplished, remove any defect that's in that first log, which is what you can see, but not stress on it a whole lot, because your next entry with a processor, harvester, will come in and gives you an opportunity. You'll see what that first log is, and you can remove a lot of them. And so what you're accomplishing by that thinning is, even though you're not necessarily giving space around every tree, you are giving, where you've removed a tree here, you allow this crown to remain green longer. And this is how you're giving an enhanced growth rate and vigor to those trees. Whereas, where there's two of them side by side unthinned, that crown is going to lift a little bit by shading and competition. That thinning on this side has left that give you growing space to keep that tree growing. And so here's Vann doing it in one part of his stand manually, as I said, later than he had hoped to do, but going in there and taking out a whole bunch. This was a different stand than the one I just had a picture of, and he had more like it had seeded in. So he had 6 trees in 100th area plot. So he had like 600 trees to the acre. He took out half of them and brought it down to around 3 or 300 trees to the acre. And as I said, it took a lot of work at this point because of when he got it done. And that's sort of what it looks like afterwards. And he cut them down, cut them up a little bit. And what you choose to do with fuels and slash is going to depend on you and your situation. There, he just cut it down and left it. Other option, of course, is you don't necessarily have to get it to fall down. Vann cut them several times so he could get them to fall down and lay flat. Other people would say, well, I would just cut through it, and if it's still standing up, it's half mile from any house or road. I don't care. I'll let it just rot and fall down on its own pace. That's certainly for Douglas-Fir, not Ponderosa Pine, but for Douglas-Fir, that's a fine option. Some people might girdle them, and that's another approach, more often used in older trees. This is just a reminder that young stand thinning, PCT, is considered a forest practice act and is considered a forest practice, and so requires notification. The other option that Vann was considering and actually using in that young stand in the field was row thinning, where he went in and didn't make a lot of selection. He knew he had 100 or more trees to the acre extra, and so he just went in and did a row thinning, taking out one of every 3 or one out of every 4 rows, depending on what his objectives were. And again, the same thing over here on the right. You can see that the unthinned area here, you'll get some crown lift, but on these areas where you took out a tree along the row, you're going to have deeper crowns form. And it seems like a fairly extreme way to go, but it works for people. Or Vann's giving it a try, and he also was able to use it mechanically. A lot of people would start this by hand because you don't have as much of an issue of things hanging up. You can start here and just lay them down one at a time. You're going to have a lot of debris there. So Vann decided that he was going to instead hired a guy with a piece of power equipment and drove through and just knocked them down and mulched them. And I'm due to go back and see how that's looking now, but you can see they were pruned, and then he did a row thinning on that large field that was just totally stocked. Oh, and yes, I skipped by, you can choose, how much, and if it's somewhere in between, you maybe take one of 4 rows and then go in and do a little hand thinning in between if you want to tweak your number somewhere in between the option of 3 to, 1 of 3 or 1 of 4 rows. So there's ways you can get to what you want. So we're wrapping up here. This is just to remind you, I have a couple resources that are available to you that you can follow up on. This is the one that tells you about how to lay in plots, among other things. I'd encourage you to go to Know Your Forest and look through the Thinning My Forest and Reduce Fire Hazard tabs. The tables newer versions of the tables that I use just to illustrate the density table. This publication has tables for, I think, 6 or 7 species that you can look at and think about. And I also gave you some links to a blog that talks specifically about young stand thinning. There's a series of 5 or 6 that I wrote a number of years ago, and there's links to that. So in closing, you know, yes, not every young stand is going to need or benefit from young stand thinning treatment. Not every person should do it for a variety of reasons. But if you look at family woodland owners as a group, and many of whose property have started out as fairly dense plantations, and considering what their most common shared objectives tend to be, I would say that many small family forest landowners ought to be looking at that, you know, and thinking about it actively when from planting age on through year 14 or 15, and see what it will do for them. With that, I have a slide to remind you that to do not touch that channel. Stay tuned. Go have lunch, nice leisurely lunch, and come back at 3 o'clock to hear about small engine care and maintenance from Rob Clark there in Oregon City. And you'll learn how to keep your chainsaw and other equipment running to go out and do your young stand thinnings. And there we are. I think we have time for questions. I'm going to leave you with my mantra of thin early and thin often. And there's some of those power tools that Rob will be talking about for you.
All right, thank you, Brad. Well, we have a lot of questions, and
Oh dear.
well, this is great. You might want to move through them, do the kind of lightning round version, but also we'll stay for overtime. So we'll stay until 11:45. So if the questions keep piling up, but let's try to take care of as many as we can before 11:30. And I'm going to interject a poll there.
You can prioritize as you see fit then.
Yeah, here we go. So this one's pretty quick. Are the tree per acre targets the same for cedars? I think we've kind of covered that, but
nope. Go to the competition publication and look up the tables, and you'll have different numbers for cedar. They, being more shade tolerant, you would allow a little higher density for them.
Yep. Okay, and then here's a question. If my stand has 250 trees per acre on average, but has clusters of trees close together that look more like 500 trees per acre, do those clusters need to be thinned, or is it just the overall trees per acre that's relevant?
Yeah, it varies. It depends. Our favorite extension answer. I think it's important that, you know, for the part of the objective that means that you can get to a break-even point, then having a significant part of the stand which is going to be thinnable and be producing income is good. However, as I alluded to earlier, many objectives for family forest landowners are often met by not necessarily looking to make things absolutely uniform. And so having some, it would depend on how much of the stand is represented by that, and if that bothers you or not. So having some little dense patches provides a little difference in cover and so on. It might be fine to leave them, and you're just going to have to kind of work through that, is what part of that benefit you're most interested in.
All right. When commercial thinning, how best to not damage the other trees? Yeah,
well, that's really part of the next topic, and that's you work with your operator. You shop around, you get you find out who operators are in the area, you talk to your neighbors, other woodland owners who've had some similar work of maybe similar age done, and you find out who has been doing work in your area, how happy those people are, your neighbors, and you talk to to that operator, and make sure that they understand that you guys can communicate well and that they understand what you're wanting to have accomplished, and that the commercial thinning, that leaving a healthy, vigorous stand is part of your objective. And, you know, a little wider spacing, I've heard, is, I mean, you can think of how that's beneficial to that thinning operation, you know, especially something like a row thinning. It gives that operator a little more room. And that pruning, sometimes I've heard, is helpful too, because it gives that operator a little more room and a little more visibility to move through the stand, reach over and take out the trees that they want to take out.
All right. If the concern is water stress, will thinning reduce the risk, or will the remaining trees just grow faster and use the water and the risk will not be lower?
Yeah. Glenn, you and I have had that conversation over coffee or other before, I think. And it's a hard one. You know, I think in theory, I think that, you know, clearly we see lots of reasons that it would be beneficial. If they're growing in that yellow zone and have a little less stress, they have a little more resource, you know, in extreme drought situations like we have had, really, you know, in a couple of those years when we had 90-degree weather in September and no rain until October, it really came down to the site. I think the insult of that hot drought was such that, you know, everything had tapped out. But we kind of have the operating theory that, you know, if trees have a little more resource, if they're well spaced, that they don't enter that stress as soon, and that gives them a little more resilience. Do we have the empirical data showing that across all our conditions? No. Also noting that, you know, thinning itself can be a stressful thing. So it's kind of luck of the draw. If you're keeping trees growing in that Goldilocks phase, we think of them as being more resilient. But if you've just completed a thinning, you've opened up the stand, and there's trees that aren't used to being open, the year that a drought comes, that thinning may not be as beneficial to them as it would have been if you had thinned them 2 or 3 years earlier and they'd done some of the adjustments to it. So yeah, our general sense is keep things within that your optimal growing, and it's going to add to their resilience. But anytime you get to the point you need to thin, that thinning brings some risk, both in, you know, wind firmness, a little bit of that stress that occurs, the damage that might occur in the thinning operation, and then yes, little extra fuels on the ground after you've done the thinning or the pruning or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a balance. But when you do it young and the trees are still relatively open, and it's not as much shock for that first entry. Here's another question. When thinning a young stand, would you just remove the cut trees? Would you chip them, or just cut them and leave them lay? So you kind of talked about that already.
Yeah, it would vary a lot by your situation and your needs. Some people, it's the aesthetics and they just can't bear to have it there. Others, it's the fire risk, and so they choose to do some slash management to manage fire. The risk is not all equal either. Part of it would, you know, I often hear people say, well, I'm going to do some slash and brush management in the 100 feet or so along the county road, because that's where I'm afraid someone dragging something or smoking would likely get something going. So that would be situational and would depend on your tolerance to risk, what your exposure to risk might be, such as county roads, neighbors with burn barrels, you know, and your own aesthetic interest.
So we're almost at the end of the real time here, but we'll go into overtime, and I'm going to post a ending poll, and then we can keep answering questions, but I want to give you a chance to answer this next poll. And it's just our wrap-up poll. We're not going to share the results, but if you would, while we're going here, just give us your thoughts on how this presentation worked for you, and would like your input. And then with that, I'll let folks answer those questions, and then I'll ask you another question, Brad.
Okay. Before we answer a question, I will thank everyone, because some people will be leaving now, and I appreciate you coming. I thank you for the questions. They've been good and very focused. Also, I believe, Glenn, we forgot to say this, but if we can arrange it, you may get an email with a teaching evaluation from me attached, if we can figure out how to do that. And I'd appreciate you taking a moment to fill that in. It's part of our university requirements. And
right, we'll try the virtual,
try to get one filled out at Tree
version.
School. Yeah, there'll be an electronic version of it, I believe, that we have. But thank you again for those of you who don't stay on, and we're going into extra innings now.
Yeah, but that's all right. We planned for that.
Yep.
And you can always get a hold of Brad or myself with your questions. You know where to find us at our extension office and our emails. So in looking at the stand density management table, how do you account for the alder, the cherry, the cascara that are also into the stand?
Yeah, well, alder, cherry, and cascara certainly are not included in our tables. And so there's a couple ways to look at that. They are competition, and you do need to account for them in some way. They probably don't require, depending if they're overtopping and competing directly with the survival of some of your trees, then they may be weeds that need to be taken out, or you may look at them as diversity that you allow as long as they're not so close. So some part of the spacing difference between Doug-Fir, you could leave a cascara, which tends to be if it didn't get a head start, tends to be a smaller tree than the Douglas-Fir. So the first thing is to make sure that they're not going to overtop and kill your Douglas-Fir. And then if you have them there and you're willing to leave them, then you would give up some bit of Douglas-Fir growing space for them. And I can't give you real numerical things. But you also bring up a very important point when we talk about thinning and options, why it's important to primarily, the most important thing for it is to maintain your options as a landowner. Because there is your option when you are doing a thinning to make decisions, not just about density, but also about composition. If you have some minor species that you do want to have stay in the stand, and they're ones that have slower growth rates and are already behind your Douglas-Fir, the only way you're going to keep them in the stand to be there in a diverse older stand is to give them some space that would otherwise be Douglas-Fir. So young stand thinning and subsequent thinnings are a way not just to adjust density to optimize growth of a tree species like Douglas-Fir, it's a way to maintain and obtain your management objectives, and diversity is often part of that. So giving those species, recognizing it and deciding where you want to fall on that, and giving growing space to those species is an important opportunity for you to be thinking about at that point.
Yep, and I should point out that alder holds its own sometimes, and we do have a density guideline for alder as part of the mix as a tree.
Alder was on the list, then yes, we do have that one, and if it gets ahead, it will replace your Douglas-Fir.
Then it's just a question of, is that one of the trees in your stand?
Yeah.
Here's a question. I have a stand planted at 10 by 10, had 99% survival and vigorous growth, exactly what we're talking about, but now they're 15 feet tall. When to thin, there are blackberries in the stand, so should I let canopy closure occur for a while longer? That's the key.
Well, again, it's going to depend on what the objectives are. Opportunities, people will often go through and do a brushing, which would be a combined pruning lift to that first 6 feet and take out some of those blackberries, which as a step prior to doing their pre-commercial thinning, if it's on gentle, manageable ground, that lets you get your blackberries out of the trees and lets you do some weed control afterwards. PCT is very likely, you have to acknowledge if you do it, you may have to do some additional weed control that you maybe didn't want to. But doing a pruning lift, cutting down the established blackberries, separates the crown from the blackberries to some degree. And it's just a matter of how bad a blackberry problem is. And if you're willing to give up some of the benefits that you would see coming from your PCT in growth, in thinning, in diversity, or whatever, as opposed to an additional weed control cost. And that's something an individual has to balance. So that you're observing it is good, but it's balancing out what you get from the young stand thinning as opposed to what you have to give up, which is fighting blackberries a little longer.
Yeah, and I've seen blackberries grow up to 25 feet, so you kind of keep that height difference in mind.
But it's easier for them to grow up 25 feet if they're being supported by dead branches in the lower crown. And if you remove some of that, then it's a little easier to fight them.
Yeah, that's a good strategy. Here's one. Is it okay to plant 200 trees per acre and just replace trees that don't survive on an as-needed basis, which would allow us to run farm animals between rows?
Whoa, that's a good one. And that comes back to that trade-off question of why, very much that question of why plant more than you have to. Recognize that 200 trees to the acre is absolutely on the threshold of forest practices and falling in or out of forest practices compliance or not. So that seems, you got to be a risk taker if you're going to go quite that low initially, because you have a legal obligation and your tax status, et cetera, goes along with that. But you could plant closer to that. And certainly that last question person like Van Decker has a track record of very high survival. And if you're in that category, planting not much above that 200 tree to the acre area might be fine. The idea of running livestock in there gets a little dangerous depending on the age of when you're thinking to put them in, because they can be damaging to your trees, both as young seedlings, but also bang them up a little. So it's again a trade-off of what you're getting in return, but an agroforestry grazing idea might work just fine. Maybe not cut it quite so close at 200 trees though.
All right, we still have 20 some questions, Brad, so let's keep going. Let's see, do you recommend—
I didn't do a very good job, did I? Boy,
well, you're giving thorough answers, but I'm glad if people have more questions. Do you recommend thinning 60% slopes? And if so, who does this?
Okay, slopes. If we go back to my table of things to think about if you're growing, factors to consider, terrain is one of them. One of the strategies I've heard often for people is they'll be doing young stand thinning overall, and then as they're on the flatter ground, they'll do one rate, and as they go onto the steeper ground, the intent might be to thin even more heavily to a lower density. And why would that be? Because that is harder ground to operate on, and they would really like to see not having to go in as early and often, and having larger piece size when they get there, or perhaps, So yes, the higher slopes, it makes sense for many people, it makes sense for them to thin it so that they get larger pieces and they don't have to enter as early. You call up your different logging service providers and see who will send a crew down there if you're not up for it.
Yeah, and the pre-commercial thinning crews, they work on steep slopes all the time. You know, the costs might go up a little bit, but they're out there and able to do it. What percent crown height do you want to preserve when limbing up?
Good question. We generally like to see 40% or so if you're cutting into the green crown. So if you're limbing up, a lot of people just wait until they've had a little natural crown lift to 6 feet or so, and then they prune the dead branches. And there's an advantage to that because you can prune dead branches if you're careful and not wounding the stem or cutting into the collar of the tree, of the branch collar. If you're not wounding the stem, then you can prune dead branches any time of the year. If you're pruning live crown, you need to restrict yourself with Douglas-Fir to the winter so that you don't attract others. And I think that would apply also for the Ponderosa Pine. So don't prune too hard, do 2 lifts if you're getting started early when there's a lot of green branches, maybe. Restrain your green branch pruning to the winter.
Okay. And in general about early thinning, just some comments that, you know, it's easier to do. Someone said when they're not too tall, it's easier to get the trees down so they don't get hung up. And it's a lot faster when they're young and small and you can push them around and they don't push you around so much.
Good point. Yep. And I think that's great experience to point out. You don't have to wait till 15. I mean, Vann would tell you that is not when he wanted to be doing it.
And kind of related to that, how young is too young to thin? What about just respacing them when they're 3?
Yeah. Well, that comes back to, you know, if you're thinking we should be planting at closer to our target density, then you can never really do it too early. If you wait a few years, you get them past some of the other common things that you lose trees to, like deer and rodents and things like that. So giving a lot of rustic Christmas trees away at 6 foot might be good. Because they're past a lot of that, and wait on some of your pruning up until they've gotten a little bigger so you don't lose them to deer horning. But really from the growth of the stand's point of view, it can't be too early. If you knew that you were going to get 100% survival and none of them were going to have awful forks, then you might as well plant exactly what you want to have that 250 or whatever your target is for that first entry. But it's always worth hedging a little and having a little flexibility.
Here's a question. How does site index or site productivity affect desirable density?
At this point, in certainly the young stand thinning, not so much. I mean, our density diagrams apply pretty broadly to different site conditions. And how quickly it moves through those different stages of competition varies dramatically by site quality. But the size of the tree, the competitiveness is going to happen similarly.
And related to that, what is SDI? There was a note that said maximum SDI of 520. What is that?
Yeah, that's just that's a calibration marker, and that's so that it really doesn't matter much, but for people who are looking at different, you know, at the stand tables, which are based on a relative stand density, then that's the reference point that it's calibrated to.
Yeah, SDI is stand density index. It's the technical term from which we derive these tables, but we probably don't want to go too deep into that.
No, we don't need to go too deep on it. It's a number there to help that people can look at, but
Does thinning develop better quality trees that are more suitable for higher value export market?
How the density what you want to produce. So thinning and density definitely affects tree form and things like that. And I think that's going to become more significant as the stand goes on. This is an informed opinion, but I don't think that what happens in the first 10 years is going to affect that as much as happens later in the stand. So your subsequent thinnings, that first commercial entry and the 1 or 2 after that, are where you would be controlling density. And if you're trying to have an improved form with less taper, you're going to be managing the trees at the upper end of the Goldilocks. You're going to order it in a place where you're wanting to have moderate to higher competition all the time, as opposed to if you're managing for habitat diversity and structure, you would want to be managing at a lower level of competition. And I discussed some of those in that competition article we had. So yes, it definitely has a form, and when they're experiencing different levels of competition, it would be part of that.
All right, well, we're at the end of our time. There's one last question. So what's the best time of year to thin or prune? And I'll let you go on that, but I want to thank everybody for attending. And if you didn't get your questions answered, please look us up and send us some emails, either Brad or myself or any of your extension agents. So what's the best time of year to thin?
Well, as I say, pruning dead branches anytime, live branches only in the winter. Pruning, thinning for Douglas-Fir, young stand thinning. If they're young trees and they're not crashing into each other, we like to avoid operation when the bark is slipping and your trees are more subject. But the age of tree that you're thinning is going to be part of that answer. If you're thinning out Christmas tree size ones using a weed whacker, brush cutter like you see on Vann's trailer there, you can do that probably any time that it isn't fire season. And if you're going to be cutting down bigger, older trees like Vann was doing with this chainsaw, 14-year-old, you probably want to do that when bark isn't soft and slipping.
Which is in the fall or winter.
In the fall and winter, yeah.
Yeah. Well, very good. Thank you, Brad, and thanks everybody for attending, and stay in touch and tune into the next Tree School online webinar.
All right. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.